She was 73 years old, sitting on a plastic bench at a Greyhound station, with a suitcase held together by a broken zipper and a cardboard box of books balanced on her lap. And if you had walked past her that October morning, you would have assumed she was waiting for someone. But Margot Bellamy was not waiting for anyone. She had just been thrown away by the only person she had left in the world. And what she would find next, inside the walls of a forgotten house on a remote island off the coast of Maine, would unravel a secret buried for over 30 years. A secret about the man she thought she knew better than anyone, her husband. If stories like this move you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you will not miss what happens next. The box on her lap contained 11 books. She had chosen them quickly the night before, pulling them from shelves the way someone might grab photographs during a fire. Not the most valuable, not the most important, just the ones her hands reached for in the dark. Everything else she owned was still inside the house on Brackett Street in Portland. The house where she had raised her daughter. The house where she had kissed her husband goodbye on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and then received a phone call 4 hours later, telling her that his heart had stopped at his desk. The house where she had spent 8 years afterward learning how to eat dinner alone, how to sleep in the center of a bed that suddenly felt as wide as a parking lot, how to answer the question, "How are you?" without making other people uncomfortable. That house no longer belonged to her. It belonged technically to both of them, to Margot and to Diane. Theodore Bellamy had left it that way in his will, split evenly between his wife and his only daughter, because he believed they would take care of each other. He had been wrong about many things, as Margot was beginning to understand. But he had been especially wrong about that. The conversation had happened 6 days ago. Diane had driven up from Boston with her husband, a man named Russell Kessler, who sold commercial insurance and who always looked at Margot as though she were a leaking pipe he had been asked to quote. They sat in the living room. Diane crossed her legs and uncrossed them. Russell placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside was a printout from a real estate website showing the estimated value of the Brackett Street property. "Mom, we need to talk about the house." Margot had known this was coming. She had known it the way animals know a storm is approaching. Not through logic, but through a deep cellular awareness that the pressure was dropping. Diane explained that the market was strong, that Portland was hot, that the house needed work they could not afford to ignore, and that it made no sense for one person to live alone in a 4-bedroom home at 73 years old. She used the word practical 4 times. She used the word reasonable 3 times. She did not use the word love once. "I'm not selling this house, Diane. Mom, be realistic. You can barely maintain it. The roof needs replacing. The furnace is 20 years old. Your father built that furnace housing himself. Dad's been gone for 8 years. Silence. The kind that fills a room the way water fills a sinking boat. Slowly at first, then all at once. Russell cleared his throat. "Margot, we've looked at some very nice assisted living communities that would be..." "I'm not going to a facility." "Nobody said facility, Mom." Diane's voice had an edge now. The sharp impatience of someone who had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it started. "We're talking about a comfortable place where you would have people around you. Activities. Support. I have people around me. I have this house. I have my books. I have the garden your father planted." Diane looked at Russell. Russell looked at the folder. Something passed between them that Margot recognized but could not name. It was the look that people exchange when they have discussed someone at length and have already agreed on what needs to happen. 3 days later, the locks were changed. Margot came home from the library. She still volunteered there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Shelving books, helping with the reading program for children, doing the small invisible work that nobody noticed, unless it stopped being done and her key did not fit the front door. She stood on her own porch holding a key that had worked for 41 years and felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Diane's voice came through the phone before Margot could finish dialing. "I had to, Mom. You wouldn't listen. I'm putting the house on the market. I've moved your things to the garage. You can pick them up whenever you are ready." Margot did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood there on the porch she had swept 10,000 times and felt something close quietly inside her chest, the way a library closes at the end of the day. Lights off, doors locked, nobody inside. She picked up one suitcase and one box of books from the garage. She left everything else. She called no one because there was no one to call. Her sister had died 11 years ago. Her closest friend had moved to Florida and now lived in a world of early dinners and grandchildren and could not be troubled with catastrophe. The neighbors on Brackett Street were new. They did not know her name. And so she sat on a bench at the Greyhound station, 73 years old, holding 11 books and a suitcase with a broken zipper, watching buses arrive and depart with a calm that would have frightened anyone who understood what it actually meant. She was not calm. She was empty. For 3 days she stayed in a motel near the waterfront. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet. She ate crackers and drank instant coffee made with water heated in a microwave. At night she lay on the bed without sleeping and listened to the sound of trucks on the highway and thought about all the years she had spent believing that if she was kind enough, patient enough, selfless enough, the people she loved would never leave. On the third night, she opened her laptop, a 10-year-old machine that Teddy had bought refurbished and that she had never replaced, and began looking at real estate listings. She did not know why. She had very little money. Teddy's pension covered basic expenses, and she had a small savings account that she had built over decades by never buying anything for herself. It was not enough for a house, not anywhere reasonable. But she was no longer interested in reasonable. She scrolled past apartments in Bangor cottages, in Bath foreclosures, in towns she had never heard of. Everything was too expensive, too far, too close to the life she was trying to leave behind. And then near the bottom of a page she almost did not reach, she saw it. A photograph of a house on an island. The listing was sparse. Two-story wood frame home, approximately 1,800 square feet, situated on 1.3 acres. Multiple rooms, ocean views, detached storage building. Property sold as is. The price was so low that Margot checked twice to make sure she had read it correctly. It was less than what some people spent on a used car. The photograph showed a structure that had been fighting a long war against time and losing. Paint stripped away by salt wind until the wood underneath showed through like bone beneath skin. Windows cracked or missing entirely. A porch that sagged in the middle as though it had grown tired of standing. Vegetation climbing the walls with the slow determination of something that intended to win. It was by any practical measure a terrible investment, a money pit, a mistake. Margot stared at the photograph for a very long time. The house looked exactly the way she felt. She contacted the listing agent the following morning, a man named Gerald Pratt who worked out of a small office near the harbor in Bass Harbor. He sounded surprised to hear from anyone about the property, and even more surprised when Margot told him she wanted to see it in person. "You understand the condition it is in, ma'am. I saw the pictures. The pictures are generous." Margot smiled for the first time in a week. "I have low standards." The ferry to the island left from a dock that smelled like diesel fuel and brine. Gerald met her at the terminal. He was a large, quiet man in his 60s who moved with the slow deliberation of someone who had spent his entire life near water and had learned that rushing accomplished nothing. During the crossing, Margot stood at the railing and watched the mainland shrink behind them. The ocean was the color of iron. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the water, like a hand trying to keep something from rising. Somewhere ahead, hidden by fog, was the island. She could not see it yet, but she could feel it. A presence, a weight. When the island finally emerged from the mist, Margot understood immediately why the house was so cheap. The island was beautiful in the way that lonely places are beautiful. The kind of beauty that does not comfort, but instead makes you aware of how small you are and how large everything else is. Rocky shores, dense forest, a scattering of houses near the ferry landing, most of them showing the wear of decades spent enduring winters that the rest of the world could not imagine. Gerald's truck bounced along a narrow road that turned to gravel and then to dirt. The houses grew farther apart. The trees grew closer together. After 15 minutes, he stopped. There it is. The house stood at the end of a path that had nearly been swallowed by wild grass and bayberry. It was larger than the photograph suggested. 2 stories of weathered cedar shingle, a wraparound porch, a stone chimney that rose crookedly from the roof, like a finger pointing at the sky. Behind it, through a gap in the spruce trees, Margot could see the ocean. She stood in the overgrown yard and looked at the house, and the house looked back. Gerald watched her carefully. Most people turn around at this point. I'm not most people. The door opened with a sound like a long exhale. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint sweetness of rotting wood. Margot walked through each room slowly. A kitchen with a cast-iron sink still bolted to the wall. A living room with wide plank floors and windows that faced the water. 3 bedrooms upstairs, each one emptier than the last. A bathroom where the mirror had cracked into a pattern that looked like a river delta seen from above. And in the living room, sitting on the floor beneath a window, as though someone had set it down and forgotten to pick it up, she found a storm lantern. It was old. The brass was green with oxidation, the glass chimney clouded but unbroken. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The wick was dry, the fuel reservoir was empty. It had not worked in years, perhaps decades. She set it on the windowsill. I will take the house. Gerald stared at her. You have not asked about the title. You have not asked about inspections. You have not asked why it has been empty for so long. How long has it been empty? Close to 30 years, maybe more. Several owners over the years. None of them stayed. Why not? Gerald looked at the lantern on the windowsill, then at the floor, then at the door, as though he were calculating how quickly he could reach it. People have different reasons. What reasons? The man exhaled slowly. Some houses have histories, Mrs. Bellamy. This one has more than most. She bought it. The paperwork took 4 days. She used nearly every dollar in her savings account and signed documents that her daughter would have called insane, and her husband would have read twice before signing once. When it was done, she stood on the porch holding the key. A real key, one that actually worked, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not yet, but the faint outline of it, like seeing the shape of a mountain through fog. The first week was brutal. She had not anticipated how much work a 73-year-old body would demand for tasks that a younger person would have completed in hours. Pulling nails from warped boards, sweeping layers of grime from floors that seemed to grow dirtier the more she cleaned them, dragging broken furniture onto the porch and stacking it in piles for burning. Her back ached constantly. Her hands developed blisters that broke and reformed and broke again, until the skin underneath grew thick and numb. Every morning she woke before dawn in a sleeping bag on the living room floor. The bedrooms were not yet habitable and lay still for several minutes, listening to the house settle around her. The creak of old wood adjusting to the presence of a living person after so many years of silence. She found the storm lantern useful as a paperweight. She placed it on the kitchen counter to hold down the grocery list she was building. Later, she moved it to the windowsill in the bedroom she was cleaning. It followed her from room to room like a quiet companion. The islanders watched her from a distance. She met a few of them during trips to the small general store near the ferry landing. A woman named Peg who ran the register and seemed to know everything about everyone. A lobsterman named Harlan, whose face was so deeply lined by sun and wind that his features appeared to be carved from driftwood. A few others who nodded politely but said nothing. It was Peg who first reacted strangely. Margot had written the address on a receipt while arranging a delivery of cleaning supplies. Peg glanced at it and went still. "You are living out there?" "Yes." Peg placed the receipt face down on the counter, as though she did not want to look at it. "People talk about that place." "What do they say?" Peg glanced toward the door. Nothing worth repeating. That only made Margot more curious. Over the following days, she noticed a pattern. Every time she mentioned the house, conversations changed direction. People found reasons to be elsewhere. Harlan, who seemed willing to talk about nearly anything. Weather tides, the declining lobster population, the tourists who came in summer and left their garbage behind would go completely silent if Margot asked about the property's history. He would shake his head and return to his traps and say nothing more. Something had happened in that house, something the island remembered. On the third night, Margot woke suddenly at 2 in the morning. The house was dark. The wind had picked up outside, pushing against the walls in long, steady gusts. She lay in her sleeping bag and listened. There, a sound from somewhere inside the house. Not the wind, not the ordinary settling of an old structure. Something different. A soft, rhythmic scraping, almost like fingertips dragging slowly across wood. She held her breath. The sound stopped. She waited 5 full minutes before getting up. Her knees protested. Her back protested. She found the flashlight she kept beside her sleeping bag and made her way through the house, checking every room, every window, every door. The front door was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, as though someone had pushed it gently from outside and then changed their mind about entering. Margot was certain she had locked it before going to sleep. She remembered testing the latch the way she always did, the way a woman living alone learns to do. She closed the door, locked it again, tested it twice, went back to bed, did not sleep. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, the door was locked. But a window in the kitchen, a window that required genuine effort to open because the frame had swollen with moisture, was standing wide open, letting in the cold salt air of an October night in Maine. Margot stood in front of it for a long time, feeling the wind on her face, trying to construct a rational explanation. There was none. She began checking the house more carefully each morning. Nothing was ever missing. Nothing was ever moved. Whatever was happening, it was not theft. It was something else. Something she did not yet have a name for. During the second week, she began stripping old paint from the walls of the largest upstairs bedroom. The work was tedious but satisfying. In the way that all slow, repetitive labor can be satisfying, it occupied the hands and freed the mind. She had brought a small radio and listened to classical music while she worked Chopin, mostly because Teddy had loved Chopin, and playing it made the house feel less empty. She was working near the east-facing wall when the scraper caught on something. She pushed harder. The old paint came away in a long strip, and underneath it, scratched into the bare wood, was a mark. At first, she thought it was damage, a gouge from a nail or a piece of furniture. But when she cleaned the area more carefully, she saw that the mark had a specific shape, a small triangle with a line through it. She stared at it. Then she stepped back and stared at the wall. Then she walked to her suitcase, opened it, and pulled out a small notebook from the bottom. It was one of Teddy's old reporter notebooks, the kind he carried in his jacket pocket for 40 years. She had kept 3 of them after he died, not because they contained anything important. She had assumed they were just notes from old stories, but because they still smelled like him. She opened the notebook to a page near the back where Teddy had scribbled a series of small symbols. He called them his shorthand, a private code he used when taking notes during sensitive interviews. Most reporters had something similar. Teddy's was more elaborate than most. She looked at the symbol on the page. Then she looked at the symbol on the wall. They were identical. The room seemed to contract around her. The Chopin on the radio faded to a distant murmur. She touched the mark on the wall with her fingertips and felt the grooves where someone had pressed hard with a sharp tool carving, deliberately leaving a message that was meant to survive beneath layers of paint and years of silence. She searched the rest of the wall, found another symbol and another. 7 in total, hidden beneath decades of paint, arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be random. Her husband had been here. Theodore Bellamy had stood in this room and carved these marks into this wall, and he had never told her. She sat down on the floor with her back against the opposite wall and held his notebook in her lap and tried to understand. Teddy had been a reporter for the Portland Press-Herald for 34 years. He covered local politics, municipal corruption, land disputes, the small but vicious wars that people fight over money and property in towns where everyone knows everyone. He was good at his job. He was thorough. He was patient. He believed that the truth was like water. It would always find a way through, no matter how many walls you built to stop it. But he had also been private about his work. He did not bring stories home. He did not discuss sources. He kept that part of his life separate from Margot and Diane the way some men keep a workshop in the garage, a space that belongs only to them, where the rules of the rest of the house do not apply. She had respected that. She had trusted him. Now she was kneeling in an abandoned house on an island she had never heard of until 2 weeks ago, staring at her dead husband's handwriting, carved into a wall, and the trust she had carried for over 4 decades was beginning to crack like the glass in the upstairs mirror. The next 3 days passed in a kind of fever. She stripped paint from every wall in the house. She found more symbols. Some were in the bedrooms, some in the hallway. 2 were in the kitchen, hidden behind a layer of wallpaper that came away in damp, heavy sheets. Each symbol corresponded to something in Teddy's notebook. She was reading a message that had been written years ago by a man who was no longer alive to explain it. She stopped sleeping almost entirely. She ate when she remembered to eat, which was not often. The storm lantern sat on the nightstand she had fashioned from a stack of old boards, and sometimes at night she would pick it up and turn it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the cold brass, the empty fuel chamber. It was broken. It was useless. But she could not bring herself to throw it away. There was something about a thing that had once given light and now sat in darkness that felt too familiar to discard. On the 4th day, she was working in a small room at the back of the 2nd floor. A room she had initially ignored because it was cluttered with debris, when she noticed something about the wall behind an old bookshelf. The shelf had been built directly against the wall, bolted in place with screws that had rusted into the wood. But behind the shelf, barely visible, was a thin vertical line running from floor to ceiling. She found a crowbar in the storage building outside and spent 40 minutes prying the shelf away from the wall. When it finally came free and crashed to the floor in a cloud of dust, she saw it clearly. A seam, a place where someone had sealed an opening, and then covered it first with plaster, then with paint, then with the bookshelf itself. 3 layers of concealment. Someone had wanted this hidden very badly. Margot pressed her ear against the wall. She held her breath and listened. Nothing. She knocked. The sound came back hollow. There was a space behind this wall. She worked for more than an hour, chipping plaster, pulling nails, removing boards that had been nailed in overlapping patterns to make them harder to remove. Her shoulders burned. Her fingers bled. Twice she had to stop and sit on the floor, breathing hard, waiting for the dizziness to pass. But she did not quit. At 73, Margot Bellamy had learned that the body fails long before the will does. Diane had called her stubborn. Teddy had called her relentless. She called it the only way she knew how to be. When the last board came away, a current of cold air hit her face. Behind the wall was a compartment deeper than she expected, carved into the space between the inner and outer walls of the house. It was not a natural void. It had been constructed. Someone had built this hiding place on purpose. She picked up the flashlight and leaned in. Dust, cobwebs, the faint smell of old paper and something metallic like rust or blood, and objects. Several of them carefully arranged on a narrow shelf that had been fixed to the interior wall. A metal box dented and scratched, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked with age, its pages swollen with moisture. Margot reached inside. Her hand trembled, and she did not know if it was from exhaustion or from something else. She pulled out the notebook first, held it under the flashlight, opened it. The handwriting on the first page was small, precise, and slanted slightly to the right, the way it always did when he was writing quickly. When the thoughts were coming faster than the pen could move, she would have recognized it anywhere. In any room, in any century, in any life. It was Teddy's. She turned the page, then another, then another. Maps, dates, names she did not recognize, addresses, financial figures, arrows connecting one entry to the next like a web being spun by someone who could see patterns that no one else could see. Her husband had been investigating something large, something dangerous, something connected to this island, to this house, to the land and the water, and the people who controlled both. And he had hidden the evidence here, inside a wall, in a house that no one visited, on an island that most people had forgotten existed. She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest. The storm lantern sat on the floor beside her, catching the edge of the flashlight beam, its brass surface dull and cold. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees surrounding the house, and the ocean crashed against the rocks at the bottom of the cliff. And the fog rolled in from the east the way it always did on autumn nights in Maine, slowly, silently, like something trying very hard not to be noticed. Margot Bellamy sat on the floor of a room she had torn apart with her bare hands, holding a dead man's notebook against her heart, and understood for the first time that the man she had buried 8 years ago, the man she had loved for over 4 decades, the man whose coffee she made every morning, whose socks she matched on laundry day, whose breathing she listened to every night as she fell asleep. That man had been keeping a secret. She had buried her husband, believing she knew every corner of his life. Now his handwriting stared back at her from inside a wall, and she realized she had not known him at all. She did not sleep that night. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the upstairs room, with the notebook open on her knees, and the flashlight propped against a paint can, reading every page the way she had once read the first editions that arrived at the library each Tuesday, slowly, deliberately giving each sentence the full weight of her attention. Teddy's handwriting changed across the pages. Some entries were written in the careful, measured script of a man sitting at a desk with time to think. Others were rushed, the letters compressed and leaning hard to the right, the pen pressing so deeply that it left grooves on the pages beneath. Those entries frightened her more than the words themselves. She had seen that handwriting before in the margins of drafts he brought home on the rare occasions when a story consumed him completely. It was the handwriting of a man who believed he was running out of time. The notebook covered a span of several years. The earliest entries described a series of land transactions along the Maine coast, properties bought and sold through chains of companies with names that sounded fabricated. Shell corporations, Teddy called them. Layers upon layers of ownership, designed to obscure who was actually buying the land and why. He had drawn diagrams connecting one company to the next, tracing the money backward through a network so intricate that it resembled the root system of one of the ancient spruce trees outside the window. At the center of every diagram, written in block letters and circled twice, was the same name: Drummond. Margot turned the pages. The investigation had taken Teddy across multiple counties. He had visited courthouses, searched property records, interviewed former landowners who had sold under circumstances they did not fully understand. Several of them described the same experience: an offer that arrived out of nowhere, generous enough to feel like a gift, followed by subtle pressure when they hesitated. Nothing overtly threatening, just the slow, steady accumulation of difficulties. A loan called in early, a permit denied, a boundary dispute that appeared from nowhere and consumed time and money, until selling seemed like the only reasonable option. Teddy had documented all of it. Names, dates, amounts, the specific language used in contracts that allowed one party to take advantage of another. He wrote with the precision of a man who understood that details were the difference between a story that changed things and a story that disappeared. But he had never published any of it, not a single word. Margot closed the notebook as the first gray light of morning pressed through the windows. She placed it on the floor beside the storm lantern and looked at them both, the dead man's secrets and the dead machine's brass, and thought about all the things that sit in darkness waiting for someone to find them. She opened the metal box next. Inside were photographs, most of them black and white, showing men in suits standing on patches of coastal land. In some pictures, they were shaking hands. In others, they were pointing at maps spread across the hoods of cars. The images had the slightly furtive quality of surveillance photographs taken from a distance, slightly blurred, capturing moments that were not meant to be seen. There were also documents, copies of deeds tax records, bank statements. She could not understand all of the financial language, but she understood enough to recognize that the numbers did not add up. Properties valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars were being sold for fractions of their worth, then resold months later at enormous profits to entities that existed only on paper. She spread everything across the floor and studied it until her vision blurred. Then she made coffee on the camp stove she had set up in the kitchen and studied it some more. The oilcloth bundle contained a map. It was hand-drawn on a large sheet of drafting paper, the kind architects use. Teddy had mapped the island in careful detail, the roads, the shore, the forest, the cliffs on the northern end. And he had marked specific locations with small red circles, each one labeled in his shorthand. The same symbols she had found carved into the walls. He had hidden things across this island. Evidence. Backup copies. The careful redundancy of a man who knew that if one hiding place was found, the others might survive. Margot folded the map and placed it inside a Ziploc bag from the kitchen. Her hands were steady now. The shock had passed, replaced by something harder and more useful. She was a librarian. She had spent her entire career organizing information, building systems, making order from chaos. She knew how to follow a trail of references from one source to the next until the complete picture emerged. She had done it with books. She could do it with this. She started that same morning. The first location on the map was marked about a mile north of the house near a stretch of shoreline where the rocks dropped steeply into the water. According to Teddy's notation, there was a structure there, an old fishing shed probably where he had concealed a cache of documents. The walk took her 40 minutes. It should have taken 20, but the trail was overgrown and her left knee had been complaining since she knelt on the bedroom floor the night before. Twice she had to stop and lean against a tree, breathing hard, feeling the absurdity of her situation settle over her like fog. 73 years old, alone on an island, following a dead man's treasure map through the woods. If Diane could see her now. The shed was barely standing. 3 walls of weathered planking and a roof that had collapsed on one side, leaving the interior exposed to the sky. She searched it systematically the way Teddy's symbols instructed and found nothing. She checked the map again, checked the symbols, checked the walls for markings. Nothing. She stood in the ruin of that shed for 10 minutes feeling foolish and old and very, very tired. Then she walked home. The second location was farther away near the eastern cliffs. She attempted it the following day and could not find the structure the map indicated. Either it had been demolished entirely, or she was reading the coordinates wrong. She spent 3 hours wandering through dense spruce forest before admitting that she was lost. It took another hour to find her way back to the main trail, and by then the light was failing and her water bottle was empty. She arrived home after dark exhausted, with a long scratch on her forearm from a branch she had not seen, and a blister on her right heel that had soaked through her sock with fluid. She sat on the porch and looked at the storm lantern through the window where she had left it on the sill. Broken thing in a broken house. She almost laughed. On the third day of searching, she met Cora. The girl appeared without warning, the way children do one moment. The yard was empty. The next moment, she was standing at the edge of the overgrown garden, watching Margot with the frank, unblinking curiosity that only a 10-year-old can sustain without self-consciousness. "What are you doing?" Margot looked up from the map she had been studying on the porch steps. She had not heard anyone approach. "Trying to figure out where I am going." "You look lost already, and you have not left the porch." Something about the observation so perfectly accurate, delivered with such matter-of-fact simplicity, made Margot smile despite everything. "That is a fair assessment." The girl walked closer. She was small for her age, with sun-darkened skin and hair pulled back in a braid that was coming undone on one side. She wore rubber boots 2 sizes too large and a fleece jacket with a lobster embroidered on the chest. "My grandpa says you bought the old Pritchard place. Is that what people call it?" "That is what people used to call it. Now they mostly do not call it anything. They just stop talking when it comes up." Margot folded the map. "You notice that too. I notice everything." My grandpa says that is my problem. The girl's name was Cora Finch. She lived with her grandfather Harlan, the same lobsterman Margot had spoken to briefly at the dock, in a small house about half a mile south. Her mother had moved to the mainland 3 years ago and called every other Sunday. Her father was not discussed. She attended school on the mainland by ferry during the week and spent weekends on the island doing what she described as exploring and finding things that nobody knows about. Margot liked her immediately. There was a directness to the girl that reminded her of Teddy, the same instinct to look at the world without flinching. The same refusal to pretend that uncomfortable things were not happening. Over the next several days, Cora appeared at the house almost every afternoon. She did not ask permission. She simply arrived the way the tide arrives, predictably, inevitably, without requiring an invitation. Sometimes she helped Margot with repairs. Sometimes she sat on the porch and read from the box of books Margot had brought, working her way through them with a speed that suggested she was starved for reading material. Sometimes she simply talked, filling the house with the sound of a human voice pushing back against the silence that had settled into every corner like dust. It was Cora who broke open the search. Margot had mentioned carefully without revealing details that she was looking for an old building marked on a map. A structure near the eastern cliffs that she could not locate. Cora tilted her head. What does the map show? A square or a circle? A square. Is it near the big rocks that look like a row of teeth? Margot checked the map. There was a formation labeled with a symbol she had interpreted as cliff edge. Yes, I think so. That is the old Drummond warehouse. It burned down maybe 10 years ago, but the foundation is still there. It is underground mostly. You would not see it if you did not know where to look. The next morning, they went together. Cora moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who had memorized every root and stone. She led Margot along paths that did not appear on any map, cutting through thickets and across streams, until they reached a clearing where the ground was unnaturally flat. Here. Cora stamped her foot on the earth. You can feel the floor underneath. Margot knelt and brushed away the carpet of pine needles and moss. Beneath it, she felt concrete. They spent an hour clearing debris until they uncovered the edge of a foundation wall, and beneath a section of collapsed timber, a metal hatch that opened into a crawl space. Cora wanted to go down. Margot said absolutely not. Cora protested. Margot was firm. The girl waited above while Margot lowered herself through the hatch, slowly, painfully, her shoulders scraping against the concrete, her knees screaming, and found herself in a low-ceiling space that smelled like earth and rust. The flashlight revealed a metal box wedged into a gap between two foundation stones. She pried it free and climbed back out with dirt in her hair and cobwebs across her face. Inside the box, sealed in layers of plastic wrap that Teddy must have applied with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, were documents. Financial records spanning decades, copies of wire transfers, loan agreements, shell company registrations, and on nearly every page written in ink or stamped in official letterhead the same name, Drummond. Not just the name, the scope. The record showed a pattern of land acquisition that stretched across the entire coast, not just this island, but dozens of properties, hundreds of transactions, a systematic campaign to buy coastal land through intermediaries and hold it until the value multiplied. The money involved was enormous, the methods were meticulous, and the central figure, appearing in document after document like a thread woven through a tapestry so tightly that pulling it would unravel. The whole thing was Silas Drummond. Margot knew the name. Everyone on the island knew the name. Drummond Development owned most of the commercial waterfront in 3 counties. Silas Drummond sat on the boards of hospitals and museums. He donated to charities. He gave speeches at town meetings about preserving the character of the Maine coast. And according to the documents in Margot's hands, he had spent decades stealing it. She brought everything home and spread it across the kitchen table alongside the notebook and the map. The pieces were beginning to connect. Teddy had been investigating Drummond for years, building a case document by document, hiding the evidence in locations that only he knew about. The house on the island was not just a hiding place. It was the hub, the central archive of an investigation that had consumed the last years of his career. But why had he never published it? Why had he never told her? She was still searching for that answer 3 days later, when a black SUV appeared on the dirt road leading to the house. Margot heard it before she saw it. The sound of an engine was rare enough on this part of the island to register immediately. She walked to the window and watched the vehicle approach. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though the driver knew exactly where he was going and was in no hurry to arrive. The man who stepped out was tall and lean with silver hair combed back from a high forehead. He wore a navy peacoat and leather shoes that were entirely wrong for the terrain. His posture had the particular straightness of someone accustomed to entering rooms and having them rearrange around him. He walked to the porch and knocked twice. Firm, unhurried knocks. The knocks of a man who expected doors to open. Margot opened the door. "Mrs. Bellamy." He smiled. The kind of smile that had been practiced so many times, it no longer required the participation of the eyes. "My name is Silas Drummond." The air between them changed. Margot felt it, a shift in pressure, like the moment before a wave breaks when the water draws back and the shore holds its breath. She invited him in because refusing would have revealed too much. They sat in the living room, Margot in the straight-back chair she had salvaged from the second bedroom, Silas on the bench she had built from old planks. The storm lantern sat on the windowsill between them, catching the afternoon light on its tarnished brass. Silas looked around the room with an expression of mild appreciation that did not quite reach genuine interest. He complimented the restoration work. He asked how she was adjusting to island life. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his entire life controlling conversations, steering them toward the destination he had chosen before the first word was spoken. Then he arrived at the point. He said he had heard that someone had finally purchased the property. He said he had been interested in this parcel for some time as part of a larger conservation initiative along the coast. He offered to buy it from her at a price that was 5 times what she had paid. Margot declined. He raised the offer. She declined again. The smile remained, but the temperature behind it dropped. Silas adjusted his position on the bench. He mentioned that the island could be difficult for someone living alone, especially during winter. He spoke about the challenges of maintaining a property of this age and condition. He noted that the nearest hospital was a 40-minute ferry ride and a 30-minute drive from the terminal. These were not threats. They were facts arranged in the shape of threats presented with the polished deniability of a man who understood that the most effective pressure is the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Margot listened without interrupting. She had spent 41 years married to a journalist. She recognized the technique. She had seen Teddy describe it in his notebooks, the way powerful men communicate danger without ever saying a dangerous word. When Silas finished speaking, the room was quiet. The wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere outside a crow called and received no answer. Then Silas said something that made the floor feel unsteady beneath Margot's feet. "Your husband was a curious man too, Mrs. Bellamy. Curiosity is a young person's game." He said it lightly, casually, the way someone might comment on the weather. But his eyes did not leave her face as the words landed. "You knew Teddy. I knew of him. He had a reputation. Very thorough, very persistent." He paused, also very careful about which stories he chose to pursue and which ones he chose to leave alone. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Margot felt her pulse accelerate but kept her expression neutral. She had learned this from Teddy too: never let them see the moment they reach you. Silas stood. He buttoned his coat and looked once more around the room. His gaze lingered on the storm lantern for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. "The offer stands, Mrs. Bellamy. Sometimes a fresh start requires letting go of old places and old questions." He left without waiting for a response. Margot watched the SUV reverse down the dirt road and disappear into the trees. She stood at the window for a long time after the sound of the engine faded. He knew Teddy. He knew about the investigation. And he had come here not to buy a house but to measure how much she already understood. That evening, Cora came by with a jar of her grandfather's beach plum jam and found Margot sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by documents. The girl said nothing for a few minutes. She simply sat across the table and watched the way she always did, absorbing everything and judging nothing. "A man came to visit you today." Margot looked up. "How do you know that?" "I saw the tire tracks." "Nobody drives out this far except delivery trucks. And delivery trucks do not have tires that clean." The girl was extraordinary. Margot almost said so but stopped herself because she had learned that telling children they are extraordinary often makes them perform rather than simply be. Instead, she said yes, a man did come. And he said something that worried me. Cora waited. "He mentioned my husband. He should not have known anything about my husband." Cora picked at the label on the jam jar. When people on this island know things they should not know, it usually means they have been knowing them for a long time. They are just choosing now to let you see it. Margot studied the girl's face. For a 10-year-old, Cora understood concealment with a fluency that came from growing up in a place where silence was the primary language, and the things people did not say mattered far more than the things they did. Over the following days, Margot worked through the documents with renewed urgency. She cross-referenced Teddy's notebook with the financial records from the Drummond warehouse. She mapped the shell companies against the property transactions. She built a timeline on the kitchen wall using index cards and string, the way she had seen detectives do in films, and she was surprised to find that it actually worked. The visual layout revealed connections that the documents alone did not. Teddy's investigation had spanned the last 6 years of his life. He had gathered evidence of systematic fraud land acquired through coercion and deception, money laundered through companies that existed only as signatures on paper, public officials who looked the other way in exchange for considerations that were never documented but always understood. And at the center of everything was Silas Drummond, not as a figure in the shadows, but as the architect, the designer of the entire system. A man who had built a fortune by taking what belonged to others and hiding the theft so thoroughly that no one could see it unless they knew exactly where to look. Teddy had known where to look, and Teddy was dead. That realization arrived not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, terrible settling. Like snow accumulating on a roof, each flake weightless, the total eventually unbearable. She had accepted his death as natural, a heart attack at 65. Sudden, unexpected, but not unheard of. The doctor had said his arteries were significantly blocked. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest. There had been no autopsy because there had been no reason for one. But now there were reasons. They were stacked on her kitchen table in neat piles organized by date and category, connected by strings on the wall. She found the evidence on a Tuesday evening inside a folder she had almost overlooked. It was tucked between two thick stacks of financial records, a thin manila envelope containing a single sheet of paper and 2 photographs. The paper was a copy of an email exchange between Teddy and a source whose name was redacted. In the exchange, Teddy described receiving warnings, cars following him home from the office, a break-in at his desk at the newspaper, nothing taken but his files rearranged in a way that could not be accidental, a phone call in the middle of the night, no voice, just breathing. The source responded that Teddy should consider suspending the investigation, that the people involved had the resources and the disposition to protect their interests by any means necessary, that continuing would put not only Teddy at risk, but anyone connected to him. The email was dated 11 days before Teddy died. Margot read it 3 times. Each time the words cut deeper. The photographs were worse. They showed 2 men sitting in a parked car across the street from the Bellamy house on Brackett Street. The house where Margot had lived. The house where Diane grew up. The house where Teddy came home every evening and hung his coat on the hook behind the door and asked Margot what was for dinner, as though the world were an ordinary place where ordinary things happened. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been watching their home. She turned over the second photograph. On the back, in Teddy's handwriting, were 4 words. They know where I live. The storm lantern was sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it that morning. She picked it up and held it against her chest the way she had held Teddy's notebook the night she found it. The brass was cold. The glass was clouded. The mechanism inside was frozen with corrosion and age. But the structure was sound. The parts were all there. It was not destroyed. It was just stuck. She set it down on the table beside the photographs and the email and the string-covered wall of index cards. Then she sat in the chair and wept. Not quietly. Not the dignified, controlled tears she had permitted herself at the funeral where she stood in black clothes and accepted condolences and thanked people for coming, and held Diane's hand and performed grief with the composure expected of a woman who had been married to a good man and lost him to something as common and blameless as a heart attack. This was different. This was the sound of a woman who had just discovered that the most fundamental fact of her life, that her husband died because his heart failed, might not be a fact at all. That his heart might not have failed. That it might have been stopped. She cried until her throat was raw. She cried until the light outside the windows changed from gold to gray to black. She cried for the man she had buried and for the man she was only now beginning to know. And she understood that these were 2 different kinds of grief, and that the second was worse because it had no end. You cannot finish mourning someone you are still discovering. When she finally stopped, the house was dark and silent. The wind had died. The ocean was calm. Even the old structure itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Margot wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the photographs on the table. She looked at the email. She looked at the wall of index cards and string. Then she picked up the storm lantern and carried it to the workbench in the storage building. She found a small can of penetrating oil on a shelf, applied it to the corroded mechanism, and began working the parts loose with a pair of pliers, slowly, patiently, the way you work on something when the outcome matters more than the time it takes. She did not finish that night. The corrosion was deep, but when she finally went inside and lay down in her sleeping bag, she fell asleep with oil on her fingers and the faint smell of brass in the air. And for the first time since arriving on the island, she dreamed about Teddy. In the dream, he was sitting at his desk at the newspaper. The desk where they told her. His heart stopped and he looked up as she walked in, and he smiled the way he always smiled when she surprised him. A smile that began in his eyes and took its time reaching his mouth, and he said one thing before she woke. "Keep going, Margot. You are almost there." She opened her eyes to the gray light of a Maine morning, and the sound of waves against rock, and the knowledge hard and bright as a stone in her chest, that for 8 years she had mourned a man who died of a weak heart. Now she understood that his heart had never been weak. It had been too strong for the people who needed him silent. She did not wait for morning to finish its work. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, Margot had already made 3 decisions. The first was that she would not run. The second was that she would not hide. The third was that she would do exactly what Teddy had been unable to finish. She began that day by photographing every document, page by page, holding each sheet flat against the kitchen table, using the old laptop's camera when her phone ran out of storage. The quality was imperfect. Some images were slightly blurred, some were shadowed at the edges, but they were legible, and more importantly, they existed in a form that could be copied and sent and stored in places that no one could reach by breaking into a house on an island. She uploaded everything to an email account she created that morning, using the satellite internet connection Gerald Pratt had helped her set up during the first week. She sent copies to 3 separate addresses, a second account she created for backup, the general inbox of the Portland Press Herald, and a name she found in the final pages of Teddy's notebook. A reporter named Malcolm Cray, described in Teddy's handwriting as the only one at the paper who asked the right questions after I died. Teddy had written those words as a conditional. as though he already knew. By noon, the documents were distributed. Whatever happened next, the evidence could no longer be destroyed by destroying a single location. Teddy had hidden everything in one place because he had no other choice. Margot had the advantage of technology he never lived to use. That afternoon, Cora arrived with a thermos of her grandfather's fish chowder and found Margot dismantling the string and index card wall in the kitchen. "You are taking it down." "I'm making copies." "The wall stays in my head now." Cora set the thermos on the counter and watched. "Is this because of the man in the clean car?" "Partly." "Are you scared?" Margot paused with an index card in each hand. She considered lying. She considered deflecting with humor the way adults do when children ask questions that deserve honest answers, but receive comfortable ones instead. "Yes, but I have been scared before. When you get to be my age, you learn that fear does not kill you. It just makes the coffee taste worse in the morning." Cora almost smiled. "That is not a real saying. It is now." The response from Malcolm Cray arrived 2 days later. The email was brief and careful, written with the caution of someone who understood that certain messages should contain as little identifying information as possible. He confirmed that he had worked with Teddy. He confirmed that Teddy had told him about the investigation before his death. He confirmed that he had spent years trying to locate the evidence Teddy described but had never found it. He asked if he could call her. They spoke for 90 minutes. Malcolm's voice was younger than she expected, mid-40s maybe. But it carried the same deliberate cadence she recognized from Teddy's phone conversations with sources. The habit of choosing words carefully, because words once spoken cannot be retrieved. He told her what he knew. Teddy had approached him 8 months before his death with a partial outline of the Drummond investigation. He wanted a second reporter involved, someone who could continue the work if something prevented him from finishing it. Malcolm had agreed. They met several times, always in person, never at the newspaper. Teddy was cautious in a way that went beyond professional prudence. He was afraid. Then Teddy died, and Malcolm searched. He went through Teddy's desk, his files at the newspaper, his home office in Portland. Margot remembered that a young reporter who came to the house a week after the funeral, saying he wanted to write a tribute piece about Teddy's career. She had let him look through the study. He had found nothing because there was nothing to find. Teddy had kept all of it here on the island, inside walls and buried in the ground. Malcolm told Margot that with the documents she had sent, there was enough to begin a formal investigation. He had contacts at the State Attorney General's office. He had colleagues at larger publications who could provide resources and legal protection. But he needed her permission to proceed, and he needed her to understand what proceeding would mean. "They will come after you. Not physically, legally. Drummond has lawyers the way other people have furniture. They will try to discredit you, discredit Teddy, discredit the documents themselves. It will be slow and expensive and deeply unpleasant." Margot looked at the storm lantern sitting on the kitchen counter. She had been working on it every evening, applying oil to the corroded mechanism, cleaning the brass with vinegar, and salt polishing the glass chimney with newspaper, the way her mother had taught her to clean windows 70 years ago. The parts were loosening. The wheel that controlled the wick had begun to turn stiffly, reluctantly, but it moved. Do it. 3 days later, the island changed. It began with small things. A bag of groceries left on the porch with no note. Firewood stacked neatly beside the storage building, enough for a week, cut to the right length for the wood stove split, with the precision of someone who had been splitting wood their entire life. A coil of new rope appeared on the railing, the kind used for securing boats in heavy weather. Margot did not know who was leaving these things. She asked Cora, who shrugged with the elaborate innocence of a child who knows exactly what is happening, but has been instructed not to say. Then Harlan came. He arrived on a Thursday morning, walking up the path with the slow rocking gait of a man whose legs had spent more time on water than on land. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a paper bag in the other. He sat both on the porch and looked at Margot with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not suspicion, not discomfort. Something closer to respect. Heard you had a visitor last week. Word travels fast on an island. Word does not need to travel. It lives here permanently. He opened the toolbox and began inspecting the porch railing without being asked. While he worked, he talked, not much, not quickly, but more than he had ever spoken to her before. He told her that Teddy had come to the island years ago, several times, always alone, always quiet about his reasons. He stayed in the house, which was unoccupied then as well, and spent his days walking the island with a notebook and a camera. The islanders noticed him, but did not interfere. People who come to remote islands generally want to be left alone, and islanders generally oblige. But Harlan had spoken with him once. On the dock late in the evening, when Teddy was waiting for the last ferry back to the mainland. They talked about fishing, about the weather, about the way the coast was changing. And then Teddy asked a question that Harlan never forgot. He asked who really owned this island. Harlan pulled a nail from the railing and examined it. Everybody knew the answer. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Still do not mostly. But some of us remember what this place looked like before the money came in and started buying everything that was not nailed down. And some of us remember the people who tried to do something about it and then were not around anymore. He looked at Margot directly. Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Bellamy. I am sorry nobody told you sooner. He finished the railing, left the paper bag which contained 2 pounds of fresh haddock, and walked back down the path without another word. That night, Margot cried again. But this time the tears were different. They were not the shattering grief of discovery. They were the quiet, exhausting tears of a woman who was learning at 73 that her husband had been braver than she knew, lonelier than she imagined, and more frightened than he ever allowed her to see. She fell asleep in the chair with the storm lantern in her lap. The wick mechanism was almost free now. One more session with the oil and the pliers, and she thought it might turn. The news broke on a Monday. Malcolm Cray published first a detailed, carefully sourced investigation in the Press Herald that traced 40 years of land fraud along the Maine coast. The article named Drummond Development as the central entity. It described the shell companies, the coerced sales, the corrupted officials. It included photographs from Teddy's files and quoted documents that had been hidden inside the walls of a house that most people had forgotten existed. Within hours, other outlets picked up the story. By evening, the state attorney general had announced a preliminary review. By the following morning, Drummond Development's offices in Portland and Bangor had been visited by investigators carrying subpoenas. Silas Drummond released a statement through his attorneys denying all allegations. The statement was long polished and expensive, constructed from the same materials as his pea coat and his leather shoes, designed to project authority and respectability regardless of what lay underneath. But the documents were public now. They could not be denied away. They could not be purchased or intimidated or hidden inside walls. They existed in the world, and the world was reading them. Margot followed the coverage from the kitchen table, refreshing the laptop screen every few minutes, reading the same paragraphs repeatedly, as though she needed to confirm that this was actually happening. That Teddy's work, buried for years, abandoned, nearly lost forever, was finally doing what he had always intended it to do. On Wednesday, an additional development made the front page. A former associate of Drummond's, facing charges of his own, had agreed to cooperate with investigators. Among the information he provided were details about efforts to suppress the original investigation. Specifically, he described actions taken to ensure that a particular journalist whose reporting threatened to expose the network would be unable to continue his work. The article did not name Teddy directly. It did not need to. Malcolm called Margot that evening to tell her that Teddy's case had been referred for official review. After 8 years, someone was finally going to look at the circumstances of his death with open eyes. Margot thanked him. She hung up the phone. She walked to the storage building and sat down at the workbench. She picked up the storm lantern, applied oil one final time to the mechanism, and turned the wheel. It moved. Slowly at first, resisting grinding against years of corrosion and neglect. Then something released a tiny internal surrender. a part letting go of its long refusal, and the wheel turned freely. The wick rose through the brass housing, dry and frayed but intact. She filled the reservoir with lamp oil she had bought at Peg's store weeks ago, not knowing why, only feeling that she should have it. She trimmed the wick with scissors. She struck a match. The flame caught on the first try. Light filled the glass chimney, amber and warm and steady, and the brass casing glowed, as though it were remembering what it had been made to do. Margot held the lantern at arm's length and watched the flame settle into its rhythm, a small, persistent burning that pushed back against the dark without drama or urgency, simply by continuing to exist. She was still holding it when she heard footsteps on the porch. Not Cora's footsteps. Cora moved quickly, lightly, a stone skipping across water. These steps were slower, heavier, accompanied by the sound of luggage wheels catching on the uneven boards. Margot set the lantern on the workbench and walked to the front of the house. She opened the door. Diane stood on the porch. She looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested haste rather than style. Her coat was wrinkled from travel. She held a small suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other, and her eyes moved across the house and the yard and the trees, and finally to Margot's face with an expression that contained too many things to separate: shock at the condition of the property, discomfort at being so far from anything familiar, and something else beneath all of it. Something that looked very much like fear. Mom. Diane. Silence. The kind that exists between two people who have a great deal to say and no idea where to begin. Diane spoke first. I saw the news. Margot waited. About Dad. About what he was doing. About this house. Yes. Why did you not tell me? Margot studied her daughter's face. In it, she could see traces of Teddy, the shape of the jaw, the way the eyebrows drew together, when the mind behind them was working hard. She could also see traces of herself, and those were harder to look at. I did not know, Diane. I found out the same way you did, by opening a wall and reading what was inside. Diane set down the suitcase. Her lip trembled once briefly before she pressed it flat. I came because she stopped. Tried again. I heard you were in trouble, that people were threatening you. I thought, you thought you should protect me, or you thought you should protect yourself from being connected to the trouble. Which one? The question was not cruel, it was honest. And Diane, to her credit, did not answer immediately. She stood on the porch of the house her mother had rebuilt with arthritic hands, and looked at the woman she had locked out of a different house 6 weeks ago, and she did not pretend. Both. At first, both. But the closer I got, the more it became the first one. Margot nodded slowly. She did not invite Diane inside. Not yet. There was something that needed to be said first, and it needed to be said in the open air, where the words could not bounce off walls and become distorted. You threw me out because you thought I had nothing left to give. I am standing here because I found out your father died, trying to give everything. Diane's face crumpled. Not dramatically, not the way faces crumple in films where the emotion is performed for maximum effect. This was private. This was the face of a 47-year-old woman confronting the possibility that she had made the worst mistake of her life, and that the mistake had a face, and that face was her mother's. She did not apologize, not then. Apologies would come later, in smaller moments, while washing dishes, while carrying firewood, while sitting together in silence, watching the fog roll across the water. The apologies would arrive not as words, but as presence, as the slow daily act of showing up and staying. For now, Diane simply stood on the porch and cried, and Margot watched her, and the distance between them, which had been measured in change locks and legal documents and years of accumulated disappointment, began very slowly to close. Come inside. I will make coffee. The evening settled over the island like a held breath being released. The wind dropped to almost nothing. The ocean flattened into a dark mirror that reflected the first stars as they appeared above the tree line. The air smelled of spruce resin and salt, and the faint mineral scent of cold stone warming slowly after a day in the sun. Margot carried the storm lantern to the porch and set it on the railing. The flame burned cleanly inside its glass chimney, casting a circle of amber light that reached just far enough to illuminate the three faces gathered around it. Cora had arrived 20 minutes earlier, appearing from the darkness with her rubber boots and her unraveling braid, and a deck of cards she insisted on teaching Diane to play. The girl sat on the porch floor, with her legs crossed dealing cards with the exaggerated seriousness of someone who takes games very seriously indeed. Diane sat on the bench Margot had built, holding her cards awkwardly, trying to follow rules that Cora explained rapidly and without patience for confusion. Margot sat in the straight-back chair she had dragged from the living room to the porch on her first night in the house. She was not playing, she was watching. Three people on a porch, a woman at the end of her 7th decade, a woman in the middle of her 5th, a girl at the beginning of her 2nd. 3 generations that were not related by blood, but were connected by something more deliberate, by choice, by circumstance, by the particular gravity that pulls broken things toward each other until they form something that holds. The lantern light moved gently across their faces. Cora's expression was focused, competitive, alive with the ferocious concentration of a child who intends to win. Diane's expression was softer, uncertain, her eyes moving occasionally from the cards to her mother, and then back again, as though she was learning to see someone she had looked at for 47 years without actually seeing. Margot's expression was something else entirely. She watched the flame inside the lantern. It was small. It was old. It had spent years in darkness, corroded and forgotten, in a house that everyone believed was beyond saving. And now it burned not brightly, not spectacularly, but steadily, with the quiet insistence of a thing that has remembered what it was made for. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not need to. The lantern said it for her. The house said it. The porch she had rebuilt with hands that ached every morning and worked every afternoon said it. The daughter who had come back said it. The girl who had never left said it. The night deepened. The stars multiplied. Somewhere far below the cliff, the ocean moved against the rocks in a rhythm older than anything on the island. Older than the house, older than the trees, older than the stories people told about both. It was the sound of something that never stops, that never gives up, that continues not because it has a reason, but because continuing is what it does. Cora played her final card and declared victory with a shout that scattered 2 birds from the nearest spruce tree. Diane laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her before she could stop it. The kind of laugh that sounds like a door opening after being stuck for a long time. Margot reached over and adjusted the storm lantern's wick. The flame rose slightly, steadied, held. The circle of light on the porch widened by a few inches, not much, just enough to reach all 3 of them. She leaned back in her chair. She felt the ocean air on her skin. She heard her daughter's laughter fading into the sound of the waves. She smelled lamp oil and spruce and salt and something else underneath all of it. Something warm, something familiar, something she had not smelled in a very long time. It was the scent of a house with people in it. Cora leaned against Margot's knee and yawned. The card slipped from her fingers onto the porch floor. Within minutes, her breathing deepened, and her body grew heavy with sleep the way children surrender to it completely without negotiation. Diane sat quietly on the bench. She did not speak. She did not reach for her phone. She simply looked at her mother, and her mother looked at the sea, and the lantern burned between them. After a while, Diane stood. She crossed the porch and sat down beside Margot's chair, not touching, not speaking, just there. Margot closed her eyes. The flame in the storm lantern flickered once, caught a draft from the ocean, and then steadied again, as it would continue to do for the rest of the night, and for many nights after. A small persistent light in a house on the edge of an island, burning, not because anyone demanded it, but because someone had taken the time to believe it still could. If you have ever felt that the people around you had given up on you, or if you have ever given up on someone and wished you had not, leave a comment and tell us about the moment that changed everything. And if this story reached you the way it reached Margot, one small discovery at a time, subscribe so you will be here when the next one begins.